Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 6 of season 2 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And this episode really reminded me of the TNG episode Night Terrors, which was about the crew hallucinating and their fears were manifesting, and Troy was having visions of some dark figure inside the nebula saying to her, "Eyes in the dark, one moon circles." And it was really creepy in a good way. It was maybe the best horror episode in Star Trek. And what I personally loved in TNG was all those mysteries in which you do not know what is happening the first time you watch it, and so it provoked your curiosity, your excitement, and all of that. And that episode also had a brilliant Star Trek twist that those dark visions were actually not coming from any villain, it was actually coming from aliens who were trying to telepathically communicate with them. And it accidentally disrupted the sleep patterns of the ship, and only Troy was able to pick up some of the actual message. And in the end, they were able to understand the message and to cooperate with those aliens to escape that dark nebula or whatever. And so I think it was a really good episode. It also had some genuinely creepy scenes, like Dr. Crusher examining those dead bodies and suddenly they're all sitting, which to me as a kid watching that was actually scary, maybe one of the best horror scenes in all of Star Trek. And that episode also had a bunch of funny moments as well, like that scene of Picard imagining that someone is ringing his door and then there's no one there, and then in the end there is someone there who is knocking on the door because he doesn't answer anymore. So those comedic moments also balance the whole episode so that it wouldn't be too dark and scary. It's not a pure horror show. It also had some fun moments and funny situations as well. And so this episode of Strange New Worlds kind of rips it off. It has a very similar idea, only this time it is Uhura instead of Troy who is receiving the transmission from the aliens. And there's also no explanation why specifically her. She's a normal human, so why is she the only one being affected? There was some other human guy who was also affected, and it also reminds me of that episode of TNG because one other guy from some other ship who was also hearing the same messages, but it made sense in TNG because both of them were betazoids. And that's why only them were able to pick it up. But in this episode, it's just randomly Uhura and some other guy. And there was no explanation why was it only affecting them and not the rest of the crew. The only explanation is they simply wanted the story to focus on Uhura. And also there were some flashback scenes to her traumatic past, because you know how in New Trek shows, every single character has to have a tragic backstory, and it was mentioned before how Uhura's family died in a shuttle crash, and so now she's having flashbacks to that. So that's why it had to be Uhura, but there was no explanation inside the episode why was it only affecting her. Logically, it should have been Spock who was being affected, because Vulcans also have some telepathic abilities, and so that would have made sense why he's the only one receiving it, same as it was in TNG when Troy was the only one. So that's one nitpick I have about the episode. For the most part, I have much fewer complaints about this episode than usual. Usually I have several pages of notes, this time I have only like half a page. And so, relatively speaking, this was probably the least offensive episode of the show because it did not annoy me as much as usual. I only have a few minor continuity issues to discuss, and even there, at least they kind of paid attention. At least they tried to make sense of it. They did it lazily, but at least they were aware of the problem. And the problem is that I was saying from the beginning of the show, Kirk should not appear on the Enterprise, and specifically should not be meeting Pike. Because back in TOS, when Kirk was asked if he ever met Pike, he specifically said, "I met him when he became fleet captain and took over the Enterprise from him." And so it sounded as if he only met him once in some ceremony when Pike was promoted and he took over the Enterprise in his stead. And yet here they do say something about Pike becoming fleet captain, because he's currently, in this one episode, he's commanding not just his own ship, but also that station and one other ship. And so they now call him fleet captain in this one episode. So technically it fits with that line of dialogue when he said, "I met him when he became fleet captain," but it doesn't really make sense if you actually think about it, because it was implied in the dialogue that he took over the Enterprise after Pike was promoted and was no longer the captain of the Enterprise. That's how it always sounded to me. And if it was just some random event that he became a fleet captain for one episode, why would he even mention it in that piece of dialogue? So it doesn't really make any sense, but at least they are aware of this continuity issue, and are trying to kind of fit it in anyway. So it's not as bad as some of the continuity issues I had with the other recent Star Trek shows. For example, in Star Trek Picard, there was that scene when he has a vision seeing his father, and his father has hair, and then he directly says to him, I never lost my hair until I died, unlike you, something like that. And it was a blatant contradiction with a scene from TNG in which he also saw a vision of his father. And what really annoyed me is that the writer of season 2 of Picard never even bothered to Google it. Like, I don't expect each writer of a new Star Trek episode to watch all the 1,000 episodes of what came before, but at least when you write something so specific, at least look it up for 5 seconds. It's not that hard. And so when they didn't even do that, that's when it was really pissing me off, because it's just screamed laziness and a complete disregard, a lack of care for the details at all. So at least here they were aware of the continuity issue and kind of tried to address it. It still felt really lazy because, when he said when he became fleet captain, I imagined maybe in some later season, maybe in the end of the season, Pike will actually become a fleet captain and will lead an actual fleet into battle against some big enemy to save the Federation, something epic like that, and maybe there will be an actual ceremony in which he's promoted and then Kirk will take over, and that's when he meets him, something epic like that. And in the end, it's just a random meeting and just an offhand comment, oh, you're a fleet captain in this one episode because you're commanding 2 ships and not just one. And so it seems kind of cheap and lazy just to fit it in with that old line in the old show. But at least they did acknowledge it, so it's not as bad as some of the other continuity problems. And also I always said we don't really need Kirk on the show, maybe he should only show up in the very end of the show. Having him show up prematurely is a doorway to many more continuity issues, like how come he never heard about the Gorn in TOS, if his own ship and his own crew encountered them before and yet he never heard about it. So having him be on the show is just a doorway to more continuity issues, like him meeting La'an, Noonien, and Singh, for example. Things like that don't really line up, even if they try to somehow explain it. And that's why the alternate timeline excuse is just the best one, because we can simply say it's all in a parallel reality, so it doesn't have to be the same continuity, and then it's more like a reboot, a remake. And it will be better for the show as well, because it will free them from these chains. Then they can do whatever they want and it will be more interesting. And there's also a scene with Spock and Nurse Chapel discussing their relationship, and she's suggesting to keep it a secret to avoid problems. Which is, again, it's like classifying everything like what they did with Discovery to keep it in the same continuity. So it stretches believability too much to really acknowledge it as a prequel, so it will never fit in perfectly. But at least they're kind of trying, so I do appreciate at least some attention to detail in this episode. They do things with him which make it worthwhile, like showing him with his brother and their relationship was kind of interesting, and seeing him meet Uhura and Spock for the first time was interesting. And by the way, the scene in which Kirk meets Uhura is in the bar, that she sits in the bar and happens to be right next to him, and that's exactly what happened in the 2009 movie, when they also met in a bar. And that's also something I keep noticing in this new show, that it's as if they're deliberately trying to imitate the JJ movies even more than they do with the old Star Trek shows, and so it's like a deliberate homage, I guess. And there's also a scene when the view screen on the bridge is cracking and breaking and people fly out of the window of the bridge, and that's exactly like in the JJ movies, in which the view screen is just a window for some reason. At least it all turned out to be just a hallucination by Uhura, so we can use that as an excuse and say it's not actually a window like in the JJ movies, it's just how she imagined it in her hallucination, and so that way it's not as stupid as the view screen actually being a window. So anyway, Uhura meets Kirk, and he's kind of the only one who believes her that her hallucinations are not just her being crazy, and actually helps her out. And they did manage to make Kirk kind of likable in this episode. And there's also a moment when Uhura accidentally punches him out because she imagines something else, and then it's him, and of course she's much stronger than him, and so she easily knocks him out and he's bleeding from the nose, and then she has to help him get to sickbay. And I didn't have a problem with this specific scene, but there is a pattern in all the new Trek shows showing how men are much weaker than women. And also when I mentioned that other guy who's also seeing the same hallucinations as Uhura, when they show that guy, he's all scared and he's all hiding in a corner, shaking, while she's never as scared in this whole episode. And it reminded me of something I complained about in a previous episode, when everyone lost their memory and we saw everyone roaming in the corridor and people were confused, but no one was really scared except one guy who was sitting in a corner shaking, while all the women in the corridor were not as scared. And so there is a tendency on the show to do stuff like that, to show that men are weaker than women. They constantly do it in many scenes. And so each one individually is not really a problem, but you just notice that kind of pattern that it keeps happening in every episode. And Uhura is having flashbacks of her childhood, seeing how her parents died in a shuttle crash, which was mentioned before. And it's also something that they keep doing in all the new Trek shows, that every character has to have a tragic backstory and has to deal with their pain and their trauma and all of that. And again, I don't really have a problem with that idea. It's just they keep doing it over and over again, and it's like they don't have any other ideas. They keep having to do this story about someone confronting their past trauma, their childhood memories, and overcoming them, and so on. So anyway, Kirk meets his brother Sam, and I did like those interactions between them because, again, at least it makes it worthwhile to have Kirk on the show. To see his relationship with his brother was only shown once in the old show when he was dead, and so there was no real meaning to that scene. But by exploring and showing their relationship in the past here, it would make that scene in TOS much more significant. And so that's what a good prequel should be doing. We also have a scene of La'an meeting Kirk again, and she's still in love with him because she fell in love with his other alternate timeline self, and yet he has no memory of those events, so I guess that's interesting, and I am curious to see what they'll do with her character. That's probably the biggest continuity issue of what will happen to her and how come no one remembers her, so maybe they'll delete her from the timeline somehow in the end, or delete everyone's memories. I guess we'll wait and see. And we also have another small subplot with number one and Nat Guinan working together on that space station, trying to fix something, and number one is angry about her, and later on it's revealed it's because she's angry that the previous chief engineer, that Andorian guy, died in the previous season and she's taking his place, and that's why everyone are kind of angry at her. And it once again shows how childish and over emotional everyone on the ship is. They do not seem like professionals like in the old shows. And that's another problem I have with these new Trek shows, that it's all about feelings and emotions and not so much about logic and professionalism. And so it's as if they're all acting in a childish way. They're all over emotional and they all need psychological therapy and all of that. And so I do not mind exploring those ideas and psychology and all of that, but they should not be all acting that way all the time. If it was once in a while, I'll be fine with it, but it's constantly like that, and so that's also kind of annoying to me. So the bigger story is that they're setting up this space station to collect deuterium from that nebula, and Uhura is having the scary visions all the time, and in the end it's revealed it's telepathic messages from some alien entities who live in the gas, and that space collector is actually killing them or torturing them, and so they're communicating that to Uhura. Only in the very end of the episode she gets it, and then they destroy that station to save the aliens. And that basic idea is something that was done many times in Star Trek, that there's some kind of misunderstanding with aliens which we do not understand are sentient, or that they're even a life form, and that Starfleet is accidentally harming them with some mining technology or something, and then the crew have to save them and then make peace with them. It's kind of a Star Trek trope at this point, so I do not have a problem with it, but the explanation in this episode, again, kind of lacks detail. So there's some kind of aliens who for some reason attach themselves to the gas in the nebula, and so we cannot mine that gas anymore for our fuel because those aliens are there, and that's it basically, and there is no real communication with them in any other way. It is similar to that episode I mentioned in TNG, but it was done much better in TNG, in which it actually felt like a horror episode in my opinion. It also had a bunch of comedy moments, and it was also affecting the entire crew, not just one person. It's just that one person was being affected differently. And here it's only Uhura and that one other guy was being affected, and there was no explanation why it only picked them, why only them were being affected by it when they're normal humans. And so logically it should have been Spock who would be having the hallucinations because he's a Vulcan, and then it would have been a perfect excuse for him acting crazy. You know, that's something I was complaining about in this entire season, that Spock keeps acting crazy in every episode with no real external explanation for it, except in episode 5 when he turned into a human for some reason. But in all the other episodes, there was no real outside alien influence on him. And so this was the perfect opportunity to have a crazy Spock episode. And of course, they missed the opportunity. And for some reason, it's Uhura. Simply because they wanted to show her flashbacks to her traumatic childhood, which they have to have for every character for some reason. So I think this episode could have been much better if it was set up better with the right characters being influenced and the bigger story being more fleshed out, and maybe with some better B story, because that whole plot with Nat Guinan and Number One arguing on the station wasn't really necessary. It was kind of boring in my opinion. And that's the biggest complaint I have about the episode. It just kind of felt boring despite having some neat ideas, but not really fully exploiting the potential. And yet at the same time, it was the least offensive episode in the whole show because I have fewer than normal complaints. And so I would say it's probably the best episode of the entire season so far, even though it wasn't really a great episode in any way. It was just kind of okay, but at least it wasn't as bad and annoying as the previous ones. So that's kind of my summary of it. So seeing Kirk meeting some of the crew for the first time was interesting, I guess, but again, it depends on what they do with it and how they do it. So that's my thoughts about this episode. Let me know what you think and we can discuss all of it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.